friends. And there are two things that you should know about him before he comes up to speak today. Number one is John has this weird habit. I've never seen anybody else. When he gets in a situation of imminent danger, he has the weirdest reaction. I'm not going to tell you what it is until the time, but we were in my car, and John is also a really good driver, side note, and I had just watched the Fast and Furious movies, so I thought I was also a good driver. And so I was like, John, you should teach me how to drift my car on a gravel road. And he was like, okay. So he showed me how to do it, and he did it fine. And I was like, okay, I got this, my turn. So I get in there, and I take a few baby drifts, and I'm feeling pretty confident. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to take a big one. So I get going a little bit quicker, hit this curve, and I pop the e-brake, and I start drifting around this curve, and it's going well. And I'm like, okay, here we go, I got this. But then when I went to correct, I overcorrected. And now I slide all the way to this side of the road. And then I overcorrected again, and I slide all the way to this side of the road. And at this point, I start to panic, and I don't know why I did, but I floored it. I was in complete panic. And so now I'm really drifting, and we're going off the road a little bit, and there's a ditch on each side, and I'm full out panicking. My friend in the passenger side, he's full out panicking. In the back is John, just hysterically laughing, bent over on the back seat. When he's in a situation of peril, he cannot help but laugh. And so we end up in a ditch. We spun around, we hit it, almost flipped, but did not. And the other thing you need to know about John is a man of great character. After we were in the ditch, John got out, and I was freaking out. I didn't know what to do. He actually ended up ripping a road sign out of the road, putting it under my tire, and we got out of the ditch. And I say that to say John has always been there for me. He's a man of great character. He's a man of God. I really look up to him and respect him. And I think it's a great honor for us to have him bring the word today. So would you guys please welcome John Horton?
Yeah, there were many other stories that was going through my mind of what he was going to say. But no, I appreciate that. I really do. You guys are a fortunate church. You got a worship leader that I think truly leads my heart. I think the songs today showed that. And I was actually going to say that, following something like that is very hard for a preacher because we're not as entertaining. Music goes a long way. But when we get up here, I think a lot of people are like, oh, it's over. I got to listen to this for 30 minutes. But hopefully, it's not going to be that boring. Today we're going to talk out of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 10. And what you guys have been talking about is straight out of context, right? You guys have been talking about how people take certain verses and apply them to themselves, and they kind of twist them a little bit. There's a little bit of truth in there, but they twist them. And so today we're going to talk about 1 Corinthians 10:13. And before I even read the passage, one of the things that we do is... Oh, children's church.
That was my bad. If you are a child in elementary school, K to 5th, you may now make your way back to the back for children's church. You don't have to sit through the 30-minute sermon.
Yes,
I apologize.
Yeah, I think I did that last time I was here too, actually. And the sad thing is, he warns me before I come up here. He's like, the first thing you do is dismiss the kids. And every time I forget. But anyway, 1 Corinthians 10:13, what we do is we like to look at it and then we skip over a few words and we say, God will never give you more than you can handle. Right? Everybody's heard that? Everybody's heard God will never give you more than you can handle. And when I hear that, I think, well, that's not really the truth. Because anybody that went through the Holocaust, I'm sure that was a little more than they could handle, right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer was put through more than he could handle, but it was not more than God could handle. But that's what we need to kind of decipher in this passage. It's not what we can handle, because if God gave us only what we could handle, he wouldn't really give us much of anything. He would give us very little to do because we're pretty poor at handling things. But the other thing I want to call out on this passage is that it's not even about what we can handle. They're talking about temptation. And a lot of times we skip over that word. 10:13 says this. It says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with that temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. So we're not even talking about situations that might put us in danger, or it might cause us to fear. He's putting us up against these temptations, and I guess I shouldn't even say he, because he's not doing it. What happens is when we're tempted, oftentimes we give in to the flesh. And what this is, when we give into this temptation that he's talking about, is we desire sin more than God. And people say, well, there's no way that's possible because I don't desire to sin more than I desire to have that relationship with God. But anytime you give into this temptation, anytime you give in to sin, you're desiring whatever sin is at that moment, whatever that looks like in your life. You're desiring that more than God at that point in time. And it's not just one of us in here, it's all of us. We all do, whether it be certain things we do, like gossip, whether it be addictions that we have. We want whatever it is more than we want God at that point. And so this is actually an encouraging verse because it says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. So that's telling me right there, other people go through the same things. This temptation that we face, other people go through it. So if you're in the room and say you have an alcohol addiction, you're an alcoholic, there's other people within the room that has faced that same temptation. You're not alone in this. And that's the good part about this verse. But out of context, again, we also say if he brings us to it, he brings us through it, right? And that's also another thing that is taken completely out of context with this verse. We face situations, and oftentimes we're at our breaking point, and we don't know what to do. When we could turn to God, and it says at the very end, the only escape that is offered is who? Jesus Christ, right? Jesus Christ is that escape that's offered, and that offer is always there. But oftentimes it's the last place we look. Because we have people that come alongside of us, and they put their arms around us, and they say, listen, God is never going to bring you to something and not see you through it. And although there is a little bit of truth to that, it's still twisted. We've taken this out of context. See, what happens is when we focus on what is happening with us in these certain situations, we forget about who? God. We take our focus off of God and we place it on ourselves. And we say, poor me. I'm going through this right now. I'm the one that needs help with this right now. When what we need to be doing is hitting our knees and saying, God, I cannot do this on my own. The situation that I'm in, whatever I'm being tempted by, can only be handled through you because it is beyond me. But we have these whispers in our ears saying, no, that ain't right, because he will never put you through more than you can handle. And that's just not the truth. Read this with me and we'll break it down a little bit more. No temptation has ever overtaken you that is not common to man. So everybody else has faced temptations that you're facing. There's nothing new under the sun. But it says God is faithful and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. So that right there, that's where that comes from, right? That's where it's taken out of context. People see that and they pull that little snippet out and throw away the rest of the chapter. But when you look back through chapter 10, Paul, the entire time in this letter to Corinth, the entire time he's talking about immorality. He's talking about idolatry. He's talking about rules to set up in your marriage. He's talking about all these things to the Corinthian church. And then we get to this one part and we want to pull that little piece out without knowing the background, without knowing the context that it was written in. If you look back at the beginning of chapter 10, it says, For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. So he's saying, listen, This goes way back to Moses even. They've dealt with the same temptation that you have. And this is the thing that always gets me. You got the apostles and the disciples, and then you got even the Old Testament, you got the patriarchs who were there before this wall of cloud or fire, whatever it was at the time. If it was cloud, it was stagnant, right? If it was fire, they would end up and they would follow it and they would walk through this desert. And they were there present with God, and they still failed, right? They still messed it up. Moses was presented with God at this burning bush, and what did Moses go and do? He still messed it up. Because what happens is we oftentimes turn everything back on us. I can't do this. Or the other way that's even worse is, I've done this on my own. I've made myself come this far. And what happens is you often forget that it's God that goes, and it's God's glory that pushes you to wherever you are. It's God that gets you where you are, because if we depended on ourselves, if we followed our hearts, it doesn't work. It does not work. Look at verse 6. It says, "Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did. And 23,000 fell in a single day." See, what happens is they were tempted and they gave in because they had lost sight of why they were there. They had lost sight of the cloud. They have lost sight of God, and they had turned to themselves. You remember what happened? Moses left for a little bit to go up on a mountain. He came back down, and what did they make? An idol. They've been like, it is way too long. We need to take this into our own hands and figure this out. And he comes back down, and there's an idol. It's the same way with us. You know, we're tempted, and instead of turning to the escape route that we've been given, instead of turning to God, we always turn back to ourselves and think, well, I need to get myself out of this. And oftentimes it creates a way bigger mess for ourselves, right? But it's not only us that do it. If you look back in Matthew, this is one of my favorite stories, is they're in the garden, right? The disciples are there, and Jesus goes off to pray. It's in Matthew 26. And he goes off to pray, and he's like, hey, listen, guys, all I need you to do is stay awake and pray. And so he walks off, and he goes and he prays, and he comes back, and what'd they do? They went to sleep. And so he wakes them up, and he tells them again, he's like, listen, I was gone for a little bit, and you couldn't even stay awake. Watch and pray. And so he goes off and prays, and he comes back, and what does he find again? Let me tell you something. If Jesus ever comes to me, and he's in my face, and he's saying, listen, stay awake and pray, I hope and I pray that I will be awake for that. But what happens is we're up against flesh. And that's exactly what the disciples were facing at this time. They were tired. They were wore out. They were probably scared because they knew the authorities did not want them doing what they were doing. They were exhausted. And if you look, turn to Matthew 26, verse 40. "And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, 'So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.'" So Jesus knew what was happening. He didn't sit there and scold them. He knew what was happening. He knew they were wore out. He knew their bodies were tired and could not handle much more. But he knew, above all else, that their spirit was what? Willing. They were willing to do it, but they couldn't. They were up against their flesh. And so they sleep. And it goes through this several times. And then look at verse 46. "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And this, at this point, was where Jesus was arrested and taken. So they slept up until the point where their Lord, Jesus Christ, was taken. They had the opportunity to pray in those last minutes, that last hour, and they chose to sleep. They chose to sleep. What do you do in that situation? We often sleep. We go to sleep, we put our minds on cruise control, we forget about God for a while, and then before we know it, when temptation is right here in front of us, we don't even recognize it. We give into it. Over and over, we give into it. And in this story, what gets me is if they knew that the betrayer was at hand, what would your response be? My response would probably be nervous laughter, right? Because I didn't know what was going on. It'd be nervous laughter. But how do you react to someone that you've spent those years with, close, shoulder to shoulder, face to face? He asks you to do one thing, two things actually, watch and pray. Watch and pray, and you sleep. And I guarantee you he would have said something, it would have probably sounded like a mom. I'm not mad, just disappointed, right? Everybody's heard that. I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. And I think here's what we can get out of it. Keep your eyes open. If you go back and you look at 1 Corinthians 10, keep your eyes open. Realize that when those temptations come at you, that we have a way out. That if we're not sleeping, if we're not doing all these other things, if we're not putting everything else before God, being idolaters, right? Then we will be aware when these things come to face us. All throughout the Bible, every story, you have these guys. Actually, you got Peter, who says, I will die for you. And then he gets scared. He's overtaken by fear. And when he's outside, farther from Jesus, that's the interesting thing about it, is as that night goes on, they continue to get farther and farther and farther away from Jesus, right? And at one point, when Peter is far away from Jesus, what does he do? They said, I think I know you. You were the guy that hung out with Jesus. And he said, no, I don't even know that man. I don't even know him. He slept. He let fear overtake him. He got so scared in that moment that it overtook him. Temptation overtook him. And he had a way out. He had a way out. He had the opportunity to say, yeah, I am that guy. I do know Jesus, and he's the Lord that's about to be crucified, and look what you guys are doing. But instead, he chose a different path. And he said, I don't know that man. I've never known him. If you keep on flipping back into the Old Testament, you see this all the time. Things happening. But one thing in Proverbs 22, verse 3, it answers this question. It answers what we need to be doing. Instead of sleeping, we need to be awake. Instead of sleeping and keeping our eyes closed and going day to day just doing the mundane, going through and showing up to church on Sunday, and then going through the rest of the week in neutral. Instead of doing that, Proverbs says this, Proverbs 22:3. The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. The prudent or the simple. The prudent sees danger and hides himself. What do prudent people do? They watch, right? They know what's happening. They're proactive. Or you can choose to be simple, put it in neutral. Go throughout your week not watching, not praying, not caring what happens. And when that temptation shows up, what do? You give in. Temptation, at that moment, you're desiring whatever it is more than you are desiring God. And I know it's easy to say, well, that's just not the case. That's just not the case that I desire sin over God. And I was in that boat. I kept choosing sin over God, and I kept saying, what am I going to do to fight this? What am I going to do? How can I counter whatever's happening to me right now? How can I go through this and conquer it? The greatest thing I ever did in my addiction was stop fighting it. You have to stop fighting it and rely on God, because God will give you more than you can handle. Ask the disciples. Ask the apostles. Ask Paul. Ask Timothy. Ask all these people that have went through it. Ask the missionaries in Africa if they have more than they can handle. The missionaries in China in underground churches. Ask if they have more than they can handle. Absolutely they have more than they can handle. But they serve a Lord that is bigger. They serve a God that is much bigger than temptations, than problems that you face. Much bigger. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. When I was in college, we were in class, and we were talking about temptation. We were talking about how people overcome certain things. And one of the teachers that he mentored this group of guys, and he said, what I tell them to do is when they're on the internet, when they're tempted to look at something they're not supposed to, and this is whether it be lust or whether it be pornography, whatever that may be, whenever you're tempted, cut the wire on your computer, shut it off, get away from it. And he said, they'll buy another cord, right? I said, well, yeah, they'll buy another cord and they'll plug it back in, plug their computer back in. He said, but after they've cut enough cords and have no more money in their wallet, what happens? They find a different way to combat that temptation. Because the only way through temptation is through Jesus Christ. That's it. You can fight, you can kick, you can scream, and nothing will ever change with that temptation until you realize the only escape is through Jesus Christ. That's it. And one of the things I thought was, marriage should make everything better. Should have less lust. Shouldn't have to deal with a lot of things that you deal with when you're single. But guess what? That temptation just plays at an even higher level. The stakes just get bigger. It becomes more and more prevalent until you realize that you cannot fight it on your own. And that's what this verse is saying. It's not saying that God is not going to give you more than you can handle, or that you're not going to be tempted beyond what you can take. Because we're all tempted. We're all tempted beyond what we can take, or we'd never give in to sin. If we could handle it, we would never give in to that sin, correct? If we could do it on our own, we would never give in to sin. But we can't, because our flesh desires worldly things. So as we go through this week, as we go through this day, when it hits Monday and we go to work, and we start to hear that gossip happen, right? Maybe it's not even gossip. Maybe you get home tonight, and you're sitting there, and you're starting to get tired. And all of a sudden, there's a certain movie on. And if you watch this movie, that you're going to be tempted in certain ways. But you're tired, right? It don't matter at that point. You might as well watch it. You're in your chair. You're in your lazy boy. And it don't matter. It's situations like that when instead of watching and praying, we choose to sleep. We choose to distance ourselves from God and choose temptation over the escape route. One time, we were at a good friend's house, and I remember the conversation went something like this. Whenever you're tempted, a lot of things go through your mind. You can tell yourself, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to give in to temptation. Or it might go like this also. Sometimes, I know this has happened to me, when you get faced with temptation, it's like your body decides you're going to do it before you even choose to do it. Your body tells you, hey, you know what? We're going to do this whether you want to or not. Your mind is willing. Your spirit is willing. Your flesh is weak. The only way out is through Jesus Christ. That's it. You can fight it. You can struggle with it. The only way out is through Jesus Christ. And this is what I want you to know. No matter what temptation you've given into, no matter what mess you've made, no matter how big or how royally you've screwed stuff up, God is bigger. No matter what mess you've made, Jesus is bigger. He will always be bigger. And that's the beauty of the gospel. The gospel is that Jesus Christ knew what you were going to do prior to even doing it, and guess what? He chose to hang on the cross for you. That's the beauty of it. So whether you're a believer or whether you're not a believer, his love was so great that even though he knew that you were not going to choose him in that moment, he was still willing to choose you. Pray with me. Father, I truly thank you for your love and your mercy, your grace each and every day, that after we mess stuff up, after we hit the bottom and we realize